The Pacific War in the summer of 1945. US bombers over Japan. School children cower in air raid shelters.
8月9日の日は兄が医学部の生徒だったので、広島に6日の日に新しい爆弾が落とされたらしいから。
No one aboard the plane knew what damage the new bomb would cause.
We were just following the lead plane, and I guess, I don't know, it wasn't much feeling about it. All we wanted to do is get rid of that thing.
That thing did not contain uranium like the Hiroshima bomb, but plutonium. Its development had cost billions.
What's interesting about this is they had an atomic bomb. They had the Hiroshima bomb, but all this effort was put into the plutonium bomb. So do you think all of that effort did not contribute to the use of it in Nagasaki? That's an interesting question.
These are the children from back then, those who are still alive. To this very day, they ask why the bomb was dropped, wiping their city off the face of the earth. Can you hear the words of the victims? They sing. Do they ring in your ears? Please, world, don't let this ever happen again. Life, love, everything burnt up. Remember us, world, the victims of nuclear bombs. Our world has taken on a tragic hue ever since. In the bunker, death was always close, recalled Sakue Shimohira, who was 6 at the time.
私たち食べるものなかったのでお乳が出ないんですよね。だから赤ちゃん出ないもんだからギャーギャーギャーギャー泣く。だから泣かすなってみんなもう非難の声が上がるんだけど、泣いたらダメよ泣いたらダメよってこの手をね口に当てられると、ね、泣かなくなったからいいねって言って外すとね、もう鼻まできっとね手を当てられたんじゃないかなと。
It was back there, says Michiaki Ikeda. The bomb exploded above that point. That was the epicenter. Even the university hospital in the outskirts was destroyed by the bomb. Ikeda's mother worked there.
そして私はここの屋上におりました当日。
His friend had to go to the bathroom, so they took the lift down. That saved both their lives.
エレベーターのドアがパッとこう開きます。そして2人とも一緒に廊下へ先を争ってポンと飛び出した途端ですね、右手がピカッと閃光が走って、それで気絶してしまいました。
The flash of light also penetrated the burrow in which Sakue cowered with her sister and a baby. The shockwave threw them against the wall.
ぶら下がっている人とか、真っ黒くになっている人とか、内臓が飛び出て腸を飛び出て、もう這うようにして助けてください助けてくださいって言うばっかりでたくさん入ってきてたし、だからもう全く後で人の話を聞くとピカーッと光った後にドーンと言ったっておっしゃるんですけど、私知らないんです、そのドーンは。光ってからもう随分とこう人がそこまで集まるぐらい間気絶していたんだと思うんですけどね。で気が付いたら妹も吹き飛んでるし赤ちゃんも吹き飛んでるんで、その探すのが一生懸命です。
パチパチという音がだんだん近づいてくるんですね、燃える音が。で、ここへこうしてたらいかんと思ってね、向こうを見ると、で私はその廊下へよじ登って、そしてその、壁の向こうに一人の看護婦さんが血だらけになって壁にもたれてしゃがみ込んでるんです。でそれに私が近づいていったら、その看護婦さんは怒ったような声で私を見てですね、警防団を呼んできなさい。
Through a gap in the clouds, the bomber crew had chosen a church as target. In the vicinity, tens of thousands perished in seconds or were burnt alive. Who could have invented such a weapon? The search for answers leads to New Mexico in the United States, to a town called Los Alamos. For a long time, there was but a Boy Scout camp here, until it was converted into a giant secret workshop for the development of the atomic bomb. The address was simply a post office box. Even kids were born in that box, the residents used to joke. On the operators' licenses, names were written as numbers.
There were very few telephones up here, but the ones that they did have were monitored. Mail was censored, so that people couldn't even talk about the weather in their mail to their families back home, because the security folks were afraid, well, if they talked about a certain rainstorm that happened on a certain day, then someone might be able to pinpoint the location.
At the outset, hundreds of specialists from across America and Europe thronged here. Some came with their families. In the end, there were more than 8,000. These included Nobel laureates in physics. Even in the government and military, only few knew about the secret project. Young engineers unsuspectingly handled plutonium here. One of them was Bill Hudgens.
They were assembling some metallic plutonium parts, and the fellow who was right next doing it, he dropped it. And unfortunately, it fell into what was already assembled, and it reached the critical mass, and he died from it. The other men who were standing a few feet away were affected. And the one I knew lost all of his hair, eyelashes, everything, and looked like he had a sunburn, and it shortened his life considerably. He died quite early.
On the 16th of July 1945, workers in the New Mexico desert lifted the first plutonium bomb to the desired detonation level. The test was an intricate task. Surrounding the bomb's core, 2 tons of dynamite had to be ignited simultaneously in a millisecond. It was the first atomic explosion in history, viewed by those responsible from a distance of more than 5 miles. Afterwards, they spread the news an ammunition depot had exploded in the desert.
Was it a topic that this would affect not only military targets, but wipe out the whole city?
Oh, of course, yes. From the test shots of the bomb, it obviously, they knew the extent of the destruction.
The directors pose in front of remains of the test tower, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves. But critics also spoke out in Los Alamos.
There were many scientists here who thought that we should do a demonstration for the Japanese, and they signed a petition, and Oppenheimer stopped the petition from going forward to the government.
The critics were quickly isolated. America had no bombs to waste, they later read. But did 2 bombs have to be dropped? And why?
We had 2 different kinds of bombs. We had the uranium bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, and we had the plutonium bomb that we dropped at Nagasaki. Had we had a thorium bomb, we probably would have taken out a 3rd city. But it was important to test the plutonium bomb from the standpoint of U.S. policymakers and military strategists, because that was the kind that we were going to bring into effect increasingly over the next period.
The effort that went into this was the primary challenge that the scientists faced at Los Alamos. And the implosion device was a much more efficient way of exploding either uranium or plutonium. And that was going to be the future.
Did the victims in Nagasaki serve as guinea pigs? To help America's bomb makers decide which of their prototypes should go into production? At memorial services over the last 70 years, the citizens of Nagasaki have criticized governments for their wars, including the Japanese government. Their city has always been an open-minded place. During centuries, when Japan had cut itself off from the rest of the world, European trade missions and Christian churches were in service here. They too were burnt down during the bombing. Initially, America claimed the bomb to be aimed only on military bases. But later the term dual targets emerged.
Nagasaki の場合は小倉を回っていろいろ遅くなって11時に伸びましたけどね、11時4分ですか。それもですね、郊外に家の外に人々がですね一番出ているその時間帯を狙ったものだとも思われます。
The Pacific War was a desperate war. Japan sacrificed child pilots in kamikaze attacks. American soldiers wore themselves out in bloody island battles. US Supreme Command feared an invasion of Japan mainland would claim countless victims. Washington set hope on its ally of the anti-Hitler coalition, Joseph Stalin. At their joint conference in Potsdam, Stalin was well aware of America's atomic project thanks to his spies, but he kept the knowledge to himself. US President Harry S. Truman hoped for Stalin's signature on an ultimatum to Japan. He was afraid of Stalin's refusal due to an existing Soviet-Japanese neutrality pact.
When Stalin told Truman that he was coming to the war, Truman writes in his diary, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. So Truman knew that the Soviet entry was going to be determinative. American intelligence had been saying that repeatedly for months.
But all of a sudden, Truman deviated from his plan and even prevented Stalin from signing. Why? On July 16th, Truman received a decisive message from General Groves in Los Alamos. The results of the test bomb exceed expectations, Groves wrote. And what counts is the battle test.
When Truman received the first news of successful detonation of atomic bomb in Los Alamos, he wrote in a diary, that's a real time, right? I got big news, atomic bomb successful. And this is an enormous destructive capacity. It is so enormous, so powerful, that the steel tower, 60 feet long, melted. And then immediately, melted, right? And immediately after this, but we are going to use this against a military target. We are a civilized nation. We are not going to use it against women, children. I mean, can you imagine that the powerful weapon you're going to drop in the middle of the city? You're not going to affect, the women, children. And so already there's the process of denial started even in Truman.
Historians find it peculiar that the ultimatum to Japan's leaders did not even contain a deadline, and that Truman did not include a guaranteed continuance of imperial Japanese rule, although he knew that Japan would never surrender without it. Meanwhile, Tokyo diplomats turned to a possible negotiator, one who appeared to be neutral, Joseph Stalin.
Stalin had a conversation with Truman. He says, we have to lull Japanese to sleep. And so that, of course, that from Stalin's point of view, it is necessary to delay the Japanese surrender so that the Soviet Union could participate. And Truman also wanted to delay so that the United States can could drop the bomb.
A farm in the US state of Indiana. Here, the last living member of the bombing squad looks back at that time.
Tail gunner.
William Barney is 93 years old.
First pilot.
70 years ago, in the new bomber team at Utah Air Base, he was responsible for the airborne radar.
We got out there, we met Colonel Tibbets, and he was our commanding officer, and he said, you guys are a bunch of elites. It's small, and it's very, very secretive outfit.
Together with a second bomber pilot named Charles Sweeney, standing to the right of Colonel Tibbets, he practiced the discharge technology.
We just done their flying out there for them and done the testing. They wanted it by exploding in the air, it covered so much more territory. So we worked with the MIT people, which out of the Mojave Desert, and worked in developing this bomb. We didn't know what we was doing. We done what they told us to do.
Barney's airplane unit was sent to Tinian in the Pacific Mariana Islands to load the first operational weapon. It was a long and narrow uranium bomb, called Little Boy by its builders, with a dash of fatherly pride.
We didn't even know it was an atomic bomb. I mean, what it was or anything. The only way we even knew it was a different bomb when we got our new airplanes.
Tibbets had his mother's name painted on his cockpit, Enola Gay. A 6-hour flight lay ahead of the crew. Escort planes carried photographers and technicians who were to measure the impact of the explosion. They flew too high for Japan's anti-aircraft defense.
また原爆投下の当日に原爆投下機だけでなく事前に気象観測機をですね飛ばし撮影機を飛ばしまたラジオゾンデをですね落としてさまざまなですね影響をですね測定したということからもですね明らかだと思います。
More than 100,000 people were killed in Hiroshima. As the occupation troops would later learn, some of them only left a shadow behind. As every obstacle blocked the flash of light for a millisecond, a silhouette marked its trace. Even if it was someone who had just been walking down the street. Pedestrian on a bridge, 0.6 miles southwest of Zero Point, noted the US authorities and kept it a secret for decades. President Truman received the news of Hiroshima's obliteration at sea, returning to America from the Potsdam Conference.
He got the report that the city of Hiroshima had been wiped off the map. And he jumped up and said, this is the greatest thing in history.
He was so joyful, he was so ecstatic. He could not experienced how he was jumping up and down. Why was he so excited? He is a decent man. Well, he didn't really cherish killing, other people. But I think my interpretation of this happiness is that it is exactly the way that he planned. Managed to drop the bomb before Soviets entered the fray.
Truman considered himself the victor in the race that began in Potsdam. Stalin believed he'd been outmaneuvered by Truman and was frustrated, until his hope was restored with news from Tokyo.
Stalin came back to Moscow on August 5th, right? And he resumed his frantic activities, obviously preparing for the war. And then August 6th, if you take a look at appointment book, blank. And that will show you the extent of the shock. He thought, game is up. We lost, right? And he was sure that the Japan would surrender. Well, and then there's approach from Japanese ambassador. And it was how about Soviet reply to our mediation? And then he immediately jumped to action, immediately ordered the attack, moved up the attack for about 48 hours.
Why didn't the shock of Hiroshima make Japan capitulate? Because it wasn't a shock for Tokyo, historians say. For the Japanese military high command, the suffering of civilians had never been a cause to change strategies.
Hiroshima was simply another city that was destroyed. There were 68 cities destroyed, I think, prior to Hiroshima. So this was another one. Well, it happened to be by one bomb. Okay, but the same effect. The real blow to the Japanese was the entry of the Soviet Union.
But instead of waiting to see how Moscow's strike would play out, America seemed to be in a rush to drop the second bomb, Fat Man, the plutonium model. As Japan continued to ignore the Allied urge for capitulation, Truman considered this step as justified. He threatened the enemy with a rain of destruction from the sky. The flight encountered a glitch. The plane wasn't carrying enough fuel. The third airplane didn't show up. The intended target, the port city of Kokura, and the alternative target, Nagasaki, were covered with clouds.
Yeah, we didn't hit quite in where we should have, because when we got down there, the weather was socked in, and it was not supposed to, but we started that run on radar. And we got in just near there, and the bombardier saw it. And at the last minute, he took over. And he got the target, but he didn't get the center where he wanted it quite. But still in all, it covered a big territory.
Once again, tens of thousands died, most of them civilians. The number of victims was expected to be higher than in Hiroshima, since the plutonium bomb had double the explosive force. The search for an eyewitness, pictured in an old photo, leads us deep into the country. It's just one of many photos stored in an abandoned house where the photographer had hidden them to avoid censorship. Some of these have already been shown in this film. But this last photo can't be understood without a story. The story of Mrs. Chieko Ryu, who lives in a small nursing home. For decades, she refused to speak about the war. Chieko had also survived in a bunker. Later, she found her mother, who hadn't come along. she was just a heap of ashes. What is she looking at in the photo?
うちの前に菅原さんって歯医者さんがあったんですよ。その歯医者さんの娘さんたちが何人もいらしたから確か防空壕の中にみんな入ってるだろうと思ったんでしょう。父がその防空壕の中に入っていったんですね。
How were she and her father able to identify her mother?
空襲警報でね、もう逃げ回ってましたからね。その時のやっぱり用意でもう何枚も重ねてこのお腹のところには特にやっぱり重なっとったんでしょ。その歯切れがちょっと残っとったんですよ。
She had to say farewell to her mother right there in the rubble, Mrs. Ryu says.
もうどうにもならなかったんですよ。それで歯が焦げ姿をですね、焦げた姿を見た時に足の骨のところをですね少し母としてと思ってから熱かったらカリカリカリって言ってからみんなもうボロボロになって崩れたんですよ。それでもう入れるものもなし、それでもう全然もう泣き殻もできませんでした。
Mrs. Ryu is left with a small altar to commemorate her mother, along with a sense of humility toward the gods, she says, for being able to live for so long.
はい、もうしょっちゅうですね。なんで生きられたんだろうかと時々ね感謝の気持ちをもうずっと思っております。
Sakue, the little girl, stayed in the bunker until the following day, together with her sister and the baby.
歯がね、私なんかもうガタガタガタガタガタになってね、でもう3人でただもうただ母ちゃん早く助けに来てっていうだけ一晩中その翌日まで誰も来てくれないでね。
At some point, they set out to search for their house, or at least to find what remained of it.
母は見つけることできなかった。自宅はちょっと爆心地から300メートルのところに自宅だったので、自宅で母と姉は死んでいたみたい。姉は真っ黒焦げになって手をこうってそうやって死んでましたから、誰か分かんないけど妹と2人で触るとポロポロって腕が外れたり足が外れたりするんですよ。姉ちゃん扱いの3だって泣くんだけども、誰か分からないからって2人でこう引っ掛けてこう手を当てて、この手を取ってみたら手の形焼けないから少し。
Michiaki Ikeda fled from the ruins of the hospital. He roamed around aimlessly until he finally went back. There he found his gravely injured mother.
母親は背中に100個ぐらいのガラスが刺さっておりました。でベッドに寝てたんですけど仰向けに寝れません。でベッドにこうやってうつ伏せて寝ておりました。また大学病院へ戻ってきて、で母親の姿を見た時もう涙が止まりませんでした。
There was a shortage of everything to care for the injured. Nagasaki doctors had taken on burn victims who had survived Hiroshima. They reported that Japan's air defense didn't see the bombers coming.
Most of the doctors and nurses were killed in the bombing. The facilities were destroyed. The medicines were minimal at best. They were using any kind of home remedies they could find to treat those victims who were horribly burned.
In Tokyo Bay, Japan conceded defeat. On September 2, 1945, unconditional surrender was signed aboard a US battleship. General Douglas MacArthur took control of the country. Japan's Secretary of State was present at the ceremony. In the end, Emperor Hirohito himself had ordered his divided war council to sign the capitulation. America's leaders self-righteously rejoiced that the atomic bomb had brought peace.
Well, the official version that both bombs were necessary in order to bring the Japanese around to surrender is not borne out by the facts and the chronology of the surrender process. The Japanese had been trying to surrender for weeks, if not months, but they weren't going to surrender under unconditional surrender, and they weren't going to surrender as long as the emperor's life was at stake. They hoped that they would get the Soviet Union to mediate between the United States and Japan for better surrender terms. They weren't able to get that because the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8th, and that was the end of that idea.
Hirohito was spared a war crimes trial, but he did have to relinquish his status as a living god. To his people, he claimed the bombs to be the reason for Japan's defeat. This offered the advantage of avoiding discussions about his personal guilt in the war. Both Hirohito and Truman upheld the myth of the bomb as the all-decisive factor.
And Truman wrote in the memoirs, the decision to drop the bomb was a very, very heavy. I just wanted to avoid. Well, if he wanted to avoid, then why didn't he invite Stalin to sign the proclamation? And when he knew that the Japanese government relied on Moscow, right? And secondly, they knew that the Japanese government desperately wanted to know the fate of the emperor and the emperor system. Why didn't they promise the Japanese government that, you know, there's a possibility there, right? And those two alternatives were consciously avoided. And so that's why I think it's I would argue that that Potsdam Proclamation, when it was issued, it's already decided that they are going to drop them, unless the Japanese government just, you know, gave up and we're going to accept this, and there's no chance that they would accept it, because there's no promise of emperor and so on, and so. If that is so, then why did they issue? They issue so that, in my opinion, this is alibi, so that they can justify the drop of the bomb.
But even US military newsreels showed Japan being razed to the ground prior to Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Osaka, city of 3 million, is burned out by fire bombs that razed scores of square miles. Kure, site of the empire's largest naval base. In its harbors lie the disabled remnants of a once powerful fleet, another evidence of the enemy's final inability to wage war. Tokyo, 3/4 wiped out by the superfortress attacks long before the atomic bomb. Scenes like these leave no doubt that Japan was thoroughly beaten before the atomic bomb.
In fact, you have to remember that 6 of the 7 5-star admirals and generals who got their 5th star during World War II are on record of saying that the atomic bombings were either militarily unnecessary or morally reprehensible. And probably the most outspoken was Truman's own chief of staff, Admiral William Leahy, who said that he categorized this with the most atrocious things that had ever been done. He says war cannot be made that way. And he also said that Truman told me that we would only hit military objectives. He says, then we went ahead and killed as many women and children as we could, which was just what they wanted all along.
1 year later, when the nation proudly commemorated victory, no more doubts were heard about the deployment of atomic bombs. Archival footage of huge armies and arsenals let the narrator justify the bombings.
The Japs had not quit for lack of men or arms. Great armies waited to defend their home islands. Artillery, new amphibian tanks were ready for the final battle. But as the Jap prepared for invasion, a lone B-29 dropped a single atomic bomb on the munition city of Hiroshima. The Japs were stunned, but still they hesitated. So 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. That was the final blow. So they surrendered.
It's perfectly understandable. I mean, the United States was the only country that has used atomic bombs. It used them on what Robert Oppenheimer, the director of Los Alamos, called an essentially defeated enemy. This was our good war. We were fighting fascism in Europe. We were fighting militarism in the Far East. And to end the war with something that has a negative context, something that puts a black mark on this war, is something that the United States can't quite absorb. And so it was justified by the idea that we would have lost a million troops in an invasion. There was not going to be an invasion. The Japanese were going to surrender clearly before November 1st, 1945.
For the victims of the radioactive fallout, the war's end hardly brought any relief. Some, like Sakue Shimohira, were taken in by relatives, but she and her sister soon returned to live in the rubble like others. Their illness turned them into outcasts.
どのくらいだったら髪の毛がみんななくなっちゃってね、で鼻血が垂れたらこの辺に血が垂れたらあれなんだろうって思うんだ。普通に鼻血が出る時には感じますでしょ、鼻血が出るなって全く分からないの。鼻血が垂れたらなんだろうって思ったら自分の鼻から血がなでみんなから汚いからね近寄るなって言われてね。
Few helpers noticed the rising of mortality rates among Nagasaki victims. Not due to injuries, but because more and more children were throwing themselves in front of trains.
兄ちゃんたちみたいに列車に飛び込んで母ちゃんとこ行こうと言うんですね。でダメだってせっかく生き残ったんだから母ちゃんたちの分まで頑張って生きていこうと言ったんですけどね。でもある日学校帰ってこないんですよ。
Sakue also decided to end her suffering this way. But seeing the black locomotive approaching, she jumped away in the very last moment.
もうちょっと頑張ってたらね、また違う道が開かれたんじゃないかなと。
As long-term effects of the bomb were unknown to the Americans, they set up a secret commission. The same effects were diagnosed in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Experts called it radiation sickness. Others called it radiation plague, as no remedies to cure it were known.
The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission that was set up by the United States after the war was there to study the victims, not to treat them. In fact, if they died, their remains were often sent to the United States for further testing, which is why so many of the Japanese see themselves as having been guinea pigs for the American experiment. I have a lot of friends who are survivors, and they felt that many of them feel that they were treated terribly in the aftermath. And many were humiliated. They were forced to get up on those stages, get naked in front of this auditorium full of doctors so they could be further examined. Many of them were young at the time, some were teenagers. It left a lot of very, very deep scars. So the American role in the aftermath, I think, was pretty regrettable at best, criminal at worst.
The These are some of the few who have survived until today, despite trauma and cancer diagnosis, and a childhood that left many of them shunned like lepers, even by their fellow countrymen. Who will tell the world what we went through, they say, when we are no longer here?
6年生になった時やっぱお友達がこう亡くなっていくっていうだから今でも本当不思議なその時すぐ亡くなってないのにね5年6年経って亡くなっていくっていうだからいつか自分も死ぬかなって思ってこう体がだるくなったらもうすぐ結びつけるのね私もなったなっていう
マイルもうそういう状況ですね継戦能力がないそこへ広島へ落としたとこれはもうギブアップは目に見えてるということでとそこでギブアップされるとねもう一つのプルトニウム爆弾の方の結果が見えない。
The Japanese as victims and the Americans as perpetrators? No, they say. That would be putting it too simply.
被害加害の問題がありますよね。どうしても私たちは被害者だ被害者と言うんですけども国そのものが加害の部分はあるわけですよね。そういう面ではなぜ戦争早く終わってくれなかったのか証言の中にも今言ってますはっきりもうギブアップしなかったために大義名を与えて要するに今でも100万人の兵隊を救うためとか
全くその通りだと思います。日本の軍部はもっと早く戦争をやめるべきだったと思います。はい。
A last question to the historians. With whom do they place the blame for the atomic bombs, 70 years after the tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
問題の立て方はですね、無差別爆撃の延長としての広島長崎への原爆投下という見方ができると思います。世界で最初に無差別爆撃をしたのはヨーロッパでナチスドイツがゲルニカにですね行った1936年でありますけれどもアジアでは日本軍が37年からですね5年半にわたって中国の臨時首都であった重慶に無差別爆撃を行います。
When I was very young, I said perhaps there's an argument for the first bomb, but the second one was clearly unnecessary. But the more I learned with the evidence that has come out both in the United States and in Japan and in the Soviet Union, it's quite clear that neither bomb was necessary.